IdeaCity, the smartest people, the biggest ideas.
This whole session is about activism and the pursuit of good in a world that often throws up very bad situations. James is the creator of an organization called the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted. He has had some amazing successes, and I hope he comes up here and tells us about that.
On December the 21st, 1949, a man called Timothy Evans was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife and his little baby. He was arrested in a place called Croydon, which is near London in the UK. And it was just 3 hours later, as it happens, that just 15 miles from Croydon, I was born the same day. I wasn't even a month old when on January the 16th of 1950, Timothy Evans had already been tried, convicted, and sentenced to be hanged. And I wasn't 3 months old when on March the 10th of 1950, Timothy Evans was hanged. I didn't know anything about any of this until 1968 when I was at university, just gone into university. I was still living in England. And there was a story on the front page of the paper about Timothy Evans, that the British government had acknowledged that, in fact, they had executed an innocent man. As it turned out, the main prosecution witness against Timothy Evans, a man called John Christie, who was Timothy Evans' landlord, had been the real killer, and that had been discovered, in fact, just 2 years after Mr. Evans had been executed, when the house was renovated, and during the course of the renovations, they found 5 bodies in the walls that had been put there by Mr. Christie in the preceding 4 years. Mr. Christie, in turn, had been executed in 1952 for those murders. And I remember saying to myself at the time, so what do they do now? Do they dig up the coffin and pull him out of it and say they were sorry? The criminal justice system is a human system. If you think about it, it's one of the last surviving relics of the human system because it is so dependent on human beings. It's dependent on human beings through the police that investigate the case, through the prosecutors who prosecute the case, through the defense counsel who defend the case, through the judges who preside over the trial, through the jurors who decide the case as they listen to the human witnesses who either lie or tell the truth or get it right or get it wrong when they testify on the case. Why should we be surprised that in that process there are bound to be, on many occasions, mistakes? And once we acknowledge that there will be mistakes, then a system of capital punishment has to be unacceptable to anyone. The seminal moment in my life, besides reading that story about Timothy Evans, but not actually knowing at that time that he had been arrested on the very day I'd been born, was in July 30th of 1992. And that was the day that Ghee Paul Moran was convicted of a crime he did not commit. And he called me the next day and asked me if I would represent him on his appeal. And I went and saw him, and he told me, in no uncertain terms, that he'd been convicted of a crime he did not commit. And of course that went into my mind, and I wondered when and if, what my opinion would be as I got to know the case. As it turned out, I found how important a small fact in a massive case can be in determining whether someone is guilty or innocent. In Ghee Paul's case, it was this. Christine Jessup, the person he was convicted of murdering, disappeared on October 4th of 1984 from her home up in Queensville, Ontario. Her body was found on December the 30th of 1992, a few months later, in a field some 20 miles from her home. She'd been raped and murdered, and her clothes from her waist down had been removed and were near her remains where they were found. On April 12, 1985, some 4 months further down the road, Ghee Paul Moran, her neighbor, was arrested and charged with her murder. His preliminary hearing was held in June of 1985. And right towards the end of his preliminary hearing, on June the 30th, two men, one named Robert Dean May and another, whom even to this day I'm obliged to refer to as Mr. X, telephoned the police and claimed that Ghee Paul had confessed the crime to them the previous night. They were, of course, lying. They were seeking favors for their own particular predicaments. The police followed up, came down to the jail, and wired one of the jailhouse informants, who then spent the day wired talking to Ghee Paul Moran. Needless to say, Ghee Paul Moran did not in any way confess to the crime. Rather, to the contrary, every time the crime was raised, he denied that he had committed it. But in the course of his discussions that day with Robert Dean May, recorded and so able to be listened to afterwards, Robert Dean May asked him what Christine had been wearing when she was murdered. And Ghee Paul answered him by saying she was wearing blue shorts. Well, she wasn't wearing blue shorts. She'd actually been wearing a skirt when she had been murdered. So the question then became, why would Ghee Paul think she had been wearing blue shorts? It turned out that the day before, at the preliminary hearing, it had been the last day of his preliminary hearing, and the pathologist had testified on behalf of the Crown that day in Ghee Paul's presence and had made a mistake, and had said that Christine was wearing blue pants when in fact she'd been wearing a skirt. If there was one thing her killer would have known, it was what she was wearing around her waist. And as soon as I heard that, or saw that, read that, instantly I came to the conclusion that we were dealing with an innocent man. The DNA not only exonerated the wrong killer, but implicated the right killer. On August 9th, it was a Wednesday of 1967, a man called Michel Roy, who was a firefighter but also the superintendent of the building where he lived, was stabbed to death by an intruder he came upon in the apartment building at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He died instantly on the staircase in the building. In 1972, Romeo Phillion, who was a well-known criminal, small-time criminal around Ottawa, who had been investigated originally at the time of Mr. Roy's murder, and he knew it, he'd been questioned by the police, was arrested for another charge and confessed to the homicide out of the blue, because in the preceding 5 years, no one had been charged with Mr. Roy's murder. He was immediately charged with the murder, tried and convicted on the basis of his false confession. It's a very famous case in legal annals because it's the case in which it was decided by the Supreme Court of Canada that polygraph evidence was not admissible in a court of law. Because Romeo Phillion took a lie detector test, not unlike Shelley Martel, if you remember the Shelley Martel events. He took a lie detector test to prove that he'd lied when he told the police he committed the crime. And he passed the polygraph, but the court wouldn't allow the jury to hear the fact that he had passed the polygraph. Romeo Phillion came to me in the late 1990s. And I quickly discovered that amongst the police archives, which I was able to obtain access to, the police had discovered, in fact, 4 years before Mr. Phillion's confession, that he had in fact been in Trenton at the time of the murder, broken down on the highway, and had a tow truck had towed him to a garage where they had repaired his car and he'd gone on his way. at the time of the murder. There was a police report that said this. So in other words, he was 200 kilometers from the scene of the crime at the time the crime took place. But that had never been disclosed to the defense at Mr. Phillion's trial. But there was one other piece of evidence against him that seemed very damaging as well, namely a Mr. and Mrs. Barb, who lived in the building next door to where Mr. Roy lived, had testified that Romeo had been in Ottawa and they had seen him on that Wednesday evening after the murder, which was inconsistent with the idea that he had been in Trenton, broken down in his car. And that was a problem. How do we explain the Barb's evidence? Because they had related their memory of it being a Wednesday night to seeing him when Mrs. Barb had returned from playing bingo, and they only played bingo on Wednesday nights. So it had to be a Wednesday night that they had seen him in Ottawa. In 2003, I got into the Ontario archives to look at what they had on Mr. Phillion's case, and I found therein a very short statement, maybe 10 lines to it, by a man called Monsieur Loy, who I'd never heard of before. His name had no familiarity to me at all, and he was the man who ran the bingo back in 1967, and it was a statement that he had given in 1972 to the police. And he told the police in the statement that bingo was always held on Wednesday nights. And then there was a postscript. It literally said P.S. at the bottom of his statement. P.S. In July and August, we also held bingo on Tuesday nights. So there you had, again, your tiny little fact, which essentially told me that here was an innocent man. And in fact, it was just in July of last year that Romeo Phillion was finally released on bail, pending his application to the Justice Minister, having already spent, by that time, 31.5 years in jail for a crime that he did not commit. When someone's wrongly convicted, not only does it mean that someone's in jail for a crime he or she didn't commit, but it also means, in most cases, that someone is out there who did commit the crime, who should be in jail for the crime he or she did commit. And that was the beauty of David Milgaard's case and Greg Parsons' case. Because in both cases, the post-conviction DNA testing, in the case of David Milgaard, proved that Larry Fisher committed the crime. And it was 29 years after Gail Miller's murder that Larry Fisher was finally convicted of the murder of Gail Miller and is now serving a life sentence for it. And in the case of Gregory Parsons, convicted of killing his mother, there's now a man called Brian Doyle serving a life sentence for the murder of Greg Parsons' mother. Again, the DNA not only exonerated the wrong killer, but implicated the right killer. This is a conference about ideas, and I thought I'd just give one idea, if I may, to the organizers of the conference for next year. One of the cases that I think will be resolved, finally, after, I always have to do the addition in my head, I think we're up to 45 years between now and the next conference, is the case of Stephen Truscott. In 2002, November of 2002, we filed an application with the minister to set aside Stephen Truscott's 1959 conviction for the murder of 12-year-old Lynn Harper. Stephen, as so many of you will know, was 14 years at the time of his conviction. He was sentenced to death in Goderich, Ontario. He spent 3 months on death row in the Goderich jail until his death sentence was commuted in January of 1950. What an unimaginable experience he must have gone through for those 3 months, and then the ensuing 10 years that he spent in jail for a crime he did not commit. I hope within the next 30 to 60 days, Stephen Truscott, we believe, will finally be exonerated for the crime he did not commit, because presently he's still on life parole for that crime that he did not commit. What finer speaker could you have standing up here next year than Stephen Truscott? Thank you.
Get the latest Idealist news, presenter information, and watch streaming video at www.ideacityonline.com.